how to understand when we communicate. We use a lot of things. Obviously, humans speak naturally, and we don't need to be literate to communicate. Language, many Aboriginal peoples, they speak without any literacy, and they have their languages, we now know, their languages are as sophisticated and sometimes more sophisticated than modern languages. So Aboriginal languages are actually as complex as the languages that we're speaking, and sometimes they actually have more words to express things. But Aboriginal languages tend to be, even though they have abstractions, because the nature of language is abstraction, you can't have language without abstraction, they tend not to be philosophical languages. They're not languages that have the type of thinking that develops in literate civilizations. So as a civilization becomes more literate, it develops ways of understanding, because what happens is introspection. And so as a people develop intellectually, they begin to reflect on things in a way that primitive peoples or Aboriginal peoples don't, which is not to say that they don't reflect. They do. They have deep reflection. They have religions. They have ways of looking at the world that are profound. And there's immense wisdom in Aboriginal traditions, and people who have had the experience of being with Aboriginal peoples will know that they're not, it's a different way of being than the way of settled peoples and peoples that live in complex societies, because Aboriginal peoples live in very simple societies. So logic is one of those sciences that developed in a complex society. Grammar is the analysis of language, and then it's the articulation of what's been analyzed. So for instance, all human beings speak with nouns. It doesn't matter what you call a noun. You can call it a noun, you can call it an ism, like in Arabic you have ism, you have damir, which is a type of noun, what we call a pronoun in English. All languages have these methods, and this is the analysis of linguists when they go into to try to understand language. They look, and there's a theory of Chomsky, who's a great linguist in the United States, about this underlying grammar that exists, this universal grammar. That's actually the early Muslim grammarians were very much aware of that. And they discuss these issues about the nature of language. You'll also find these discussions in the scholastic tradition, but much of the scholastic tradition was taken out of the Muslim tradition because of the influence of al-Farabi, of Ibn Sina, of Ibn Rushd, of Ghazali, and others on their discourse. But they looked and they attempted to understand the very nature of language. What is the nature of language? And language is Ar-Rahman, خلق الإنسان, right? Ar-Rahman, علم القرآن, خلق الإنسان, علمه البيان. That the merciful, he taught the Quran, he created the human being, and then gave the human being bayan. And bayan is the ability to yubayyinu ma fi nafsihi, to articulate what's in his soul. It's the ability to actually speak what is in your heart. And what is that? Does language precede meaning, or does meaning precede language? In other words, do we need language to express meaning, or is language the result of a pre-existent meaning? And our scholars argued on the side of meaning, that meaning precedes language. Al-ma'ani qabla al-mabani. Meanings precede the vehicles of meaning. And when you get into Aqidah, there's huge discussions about what is the nature of Kalam Allah. Is it the meanings, or is it the uncreated meanings, or is it the actual vehicle for those meanings? Or is it both, but from different perspectives? These are long debates in that tradition. So the analysis of language is an analysis that can be done to any language in the world. Every language has grammar. Darija has grammar. If you look at Darija or Ebonics in the United States, we have a type of a common language amongst a minority community in the United States that they speak and they understand, and it moves, it evolves, it changes, but it has a grammar, and it can be analyzed. Creole has a grammar. Pidgin languages have grammars. Every language has a grammar. There are certain languages that are profound civilizational languages, and these languages, because of the nature of their traditions, a certain continuity takes place. So Sanskrit is one of those languages. Chinese is one of those languages. The Hebrew language, the Arabic language, these are ancient languages. And in those languages are embedded profound worldviews. If you study the Chinese language, in the ideograms, there are literally cosmologies that are articulated in their ideograms. So you can analyze them. If you look at Hebrew, the same is true. There are cosmologies embedded. I'll give you one example. If you look at the word for human being in Arabic, the word that means human, that's shared by male and female, is called Insan. And many of the philologists argue that there's not a plural. Some of them say that insanatun is a feminine form. But most say insan is like mensch. It includes the male and the female. Insan, the meaning of insan comes from uns, which is intimacy. That the human is an intimate creature. It needs to have intimacy to survive. If it doesn't have intimacy, it dries up and dies as a creature. It needs to have uns. And then it's also the same word, insan, is the word for pupil of the eye. So the insan, the bu'bu, the insan is the pupil of the eye. And one of the things that we know, that when people are experiencing intimacy, the pupil dilates. It opens up. So there's an opening of the insan, that humans, when they're experience intimacy, they open up. They get inshirah. They expand. And the highest intimacy is intimacy with the divine. That the intimacy of al-uns billah, to have intimacy with the divine. And this is the greatest expansion, the inshirah that occurs. So another, just to show you the cosmology embedded in Arabic, another word for I is ayn. Now ayn means essence. It means the source. It's also used for a spring. An ayn is the life-giving for the Arabs. The ayn of water is the life-giving source. And so there's something embedded in that understanding that indicates that the eye, the secret of the eye, of seeing, that it's related to the essence of man, that we were actually created for mushahada. We're created for witnessing. Like our existence is there to witness the divine. And that's why the essence of the human being is shahada, which means witnessing. Shahada is witnessing. So Ainul Insan, the eye of the human being and the essence of the human being, is for shahada. It's to witness. So this is the nature of that. You can get into that. Now, when you study grammar, you find that there's basically two concepts in grammar. There's the concept of substance, and there's the concept of time. Substance is articulated through quality and quantity, through adjectives, through nouns, adverbs. These all tell us the quality of something. He ran swiftly. So swiftly is telling us something about the nature of the running. But running is time. Verbs are in time. So you have time and you have place. Right? This is, the human being has two orientations. Orientation to time and place. Right? So when a physician wants to look at a student, they ask them, a patient, they want to orient them to time and place. So they'll say, who's the president? And then they'll say, where are you? And then they know that they're in their right mind because they have that orientation. That's language, time and place. That's language, and that's what makes us human. Now, the other thing about language is rational. That when we speak, we have to follow an order. Table, sky, reason, nature, blue, elevate, wonderful, know, when. See, if I start talking like that, those are all words, but there's no order to them. They were just coming off the top of my head, and you aren't understanding. Each one of those words can convey a comprehension. I know what sky is. He said sky. I know what that is. But you don't know what I'm saying or what I mean because there was no order. So there is a logic to language, and that logic is expressed through syntax. I have to have an order to my language. And in our language, for instance, in English, there is a certain type of order. We have subject, we have verb, right? We have object, right? John hit. I'm going to use the Arab, because when we were kids, we learned, Dick sees Jane. Like when I was a kid, they probably don't even do that. They don't even teach grammar anymore. But in the Arab world, I told them that you're not going to get rid of violence in the Arab world until you change the way you teach grammar. Because they always teach ضَرَبَ زَيْدٌ عَمْرًا. That's how every sentence, that the first sentence you learn in Arabic grammar is Zayd hit Amr. And you're just like, what's up with that? Like, why is Zayd hitting him? Why couldn't he do something else to him? Like, Zayd, Ra'a Amran. He saw Amran. But they have the darb. They have to have the darb, right? So that is, language it follows a pattern. And when you learn a language, one of the hard things about learning a foreign language is that it doesn't often have the same patterns that you have, and it can be confusing. So in Arabic, if I said akala kusa Musa, right? Did I mean the courgette ate Moses, or did I mean Moses ate the courgette? I can't tell because they're both maqsoor, right? They have the alif maqsoora, so I don't know. But and that's why you shouldn't do that, because it's mubham, it's an ambiguous. That's a time where you should put the fa'il first, right? And then the maf'ul bihi after in grammar. So you should really say akara Musa kusa. But if you know reason, it's not reasonable that the courgette ate Musa. But there's somebody can be called. There was a minister, I think, from Lebanon. Is Shaykh Jamal here? Didn't they have Minister Musa Kusa? He was in Libya, Musa Kusa. Yeah. That's a father with a sense of humor, right? Yeah. So anyway. So language, now the nature of language is it's ambiguous. Language is ambiguous because you can say things and they can be taken in different ways, right? We have in English we call double entendres, right? You can say something and you can mean different things with it. And even our tone, like there's certain languages that tone is very important. Like Chinese, you have different tones. In English, we use tone to accent things. Yeah, he's smart, isn't he? You know, that's very different from saying, wow, he's smart, isn't he? A completely different statement, even though it's the same words, but the tone conveys something. So this is the nature of language. But language is also clear. And the clearer a language is, the better we understand it. So people say that he's very unclear in his thinking. He's muddled in his thinking. I can't understand him. What's he talking about? And teachers will tell you that. You need more clarity in your writing, things like this. So this is part of it. Now what logic does is it helps you to understand better what you naturally do. Everybody is using logic. And that was the meaning of that story. When the student comes back after the third time from the marketplace, oh my God, Ustad, it's unbelievable. Everybody's using logic. He finally got it. And that's what you see in the world. And it doesn't matter where you go. Logic is not a Western concept. What Aristotle did, and it's interesting that we're in Turkey and we're studying this because Aristotle was from Turkey. I mean, it was part of the, Asia Minor, and it was part of the Greek. But he lived on the Asian side. So he was actually, from, and he died here. But what he did, I mean, there's a debate about what he did. And we'll get to that when I do the Mabadi. So my point is that when you study logic, what you're studying is really what you do naturally. In the same way that when you study grammar, you're studying what you do naturally, which is you speak grammatically. You might make grammatical mistakes in your language. I ain't going to go there. Or, I have a friend, he's very educated, but he uses double negatives all the time, right? And he's got a, he's a PhD candidate. And I correct him because they just, when I hear a double negative, it's like, ouch. But, a double negative is a positive, right? So you're actually saying the opposite of what you think you're saying. So I ain't gonna not go there, right? So people use language and they can misuse language. And the same is true in reasoning. And that's why you learn grammar to protect your tongue from making mistakes. You learn logic to guard your reasoning so that your reasoning skills are better, but also so that you can see the arguments of others and be able to criticize them. Does that make sense? Now, one of the things about our tradition that's very important, because we have maratib al-ulum, we believe in the degrees of knowledge. In the same way that you have Newtonian physics and quantum physics. They're very different, right? Newtonian physics and quantum physics are two completely different physics. Quantum physics, all of the Newtonian laws break down in quantum mechanics. But quantum physics has been observed. So they know that underlying this Newtonian world that we live in, there's another reality, which is quantum. And they don't fully understand it, and they're trying to work out really what's going on. But the quantum world is very weird. For instance, in the quantum world, you can be in two places at one time. In the Newtonian world, you can't. You can only be in one place at one time. In a quantum world, you could walk through a wall. In a Newtonian world, you can't. So, for those of you who had the unfortunate experience of seeing The Matrix, The Matrix was somebody who was learning to work in a quantum world, right? I mean, that's really what was happening to him was that he was learning to work in the quantum world, where the laws of physics that are Newtonian don't apply. So bullets won't kill you in that world, but in a Newtonian world they will. And so one of the things that's important for us to understand is that this logic works on one level of existence. But there are other levels of existence where this logic completely breaks down. And one of the interesting things about the Western tradition is that they've never been able to really deal with these degrees of knowledge. And so they end up denying certain types of realities because they don't fit in to other types of realities. And they have a lot of problems in their philosophy because of this. Whereas the Muslims have always understood, Sharia and Haqiqah are two very important concepts in our tradition. You have a Sharia and you have a Haqiqah. If you look in the Muwatta of Imam Malik, there's a hadith where Moses and Adam have a debate. And when Moses meets Adam, Musa alayhi salam meets Adam, he says, you're the one, aghwayt an-nas. You led us astray. Right? In other words, it's your fault that this whole mess has happened. And so he's talking, that's the logic of Aristotle. That's where Musa alayhi salam was working at that level. When he made that statement, it's like a judge in a court case. You broke the law, and then there were these repercussions. Right? Adam alayhi salam, his response was, to go from the Newtonian world into the quantum world. And he said, you're Moses, you're Musa, you're the one that God bestowed all this knowledge on and gave you all this wisdom. Are you going to blame me for something? قُدِّرَ عَلَيَّ قَبْلَ أَنْ أُخْلَقْ أَتَلُمُنِي? Are you going to blame me for something that was decreed for me before I came into existence? And in another riwayah, that's not in the Muwatta, the Prophet said, Adam defeated Moses in the argument because he was using another logic. He wasn't using the logic of the courtroom, of the Sharia. He was using another logic. And so that's important for us when we go into this to understand that this is the logic of the Newtonian world. It's not the logic of the quantum world. It's the logic of the Newtonian world. But it is the logic that our Sharia is based on, that every rational system of law in the world is based on. When you go into a court of law, you are going into a court that relies entirely on logical arguments. And what lawyers do is they argue. Now, if the judge or the jury is not trained in logic, then they're susceptible to logical fallacies. Appeal to pity is a type of safsata. Appeal to pity. So they'll give a sob story that'll make these people feel all this compassion. That's actually a logical fallacy to do that. Now, sometimes it's important, but that's not an argument to do that. That's not an argument that holds up against these rigorous standards of argumentation. Or they'll use other types of fallacies. Poisoning the well is a logical fallacy. And if people aren't trained to identify these arguments, or they'll say, A, therefore B, but it's a non sequitur, it doesn't follow. But if somebody's not trained to see that, one of the great Chrysippus, who was a great early logician, he noted that even animals use logic, because he was walking once and he saw a rabbit turn a corner, and there was 3 roads, and it went down a road, and then a hound was chasing it, and it came around and it couldn't see the rabbit anymore, so it sniffed the first road and then went to the second, sniffed the second, and without sniffing the third, it just went down the third. So Chrysippus derived from that the dog was using logic, because it was either A, B, or C. If not A or B, then C. but it did it intuitively. And so this is the, this is the study of logic. It's why it's important. You cannot, one of the most important aspects of democracy is that democracy is a type of government that is saying that instead of using might to impose our will, we're going to use argument. That we make cases. So you will have, somebody will try to legislate a law and he'll give arguments. And then those people listening to it will either be convinced or not convinced. For instance, if they're going to go to war, people will give arguments. If you remember, in the United States, before the Iraqi war, what did they do? They made all these arguments for why they were going to go to war. Why? Because they're saying we have to use reason. But if people aren't trained in analyzing arguments, they can be manipulated and fooled and tricked into doing things that are dangerous and harmful and destructive. So that's why it's very important to know this, so that you can defend yourself against those types of logical fallacies. So now we're going to go into the 10 foundations. In our tradition, al-Mabadi al-Ashara are a mabda. Mabda in Arabic is ism makan. It's a place where something happens, the maf'al. Like maf'il is another form of it. So you have like masjid is a place of sujood. Matbakh is a place of tabakh. It's the place where you cook. Tabakha means to cook. So whenever you see that pattern, the maf'al pattern, it's a place of something. It can also be time as well. So like Mosim or Mawlid. Mawlid could be the place or the time you were born. So the Mawlid in Mecca is where the Prophet was born, but the Mawlid is also the 12th of Rabi' al-Awwal, according to most of the scholars. So mabda is the place where you begin something. The mabda, bada'tu, I began, abda'u, kullu amrin dhi bal, lam yubda bi bismillah fahuwa abtar. Every affair that is momentous or weighty, that does not begin with bismillah, is cut off of barakah. So we begin things, bada'tu. The mabda is a starting place. It also means the principle. Now if you look at principle, it comes from a Latin word, principia, which means first. Right? So it's also the same idea. The principles are those first things, the axioms, the things that things are based upon, predicated upon. So sciences have, our scholars identified 10 mabadi that students should always begin their coursework. And for those of you who have studied with me over the years, I've always tried to begin my classes with Mabadi al-Ashara. And so this is Muhammad bin Ali al-Sabban was a great grammarian. He's famous for a commentary on the Alfiya of Ibn Malik. He versified, there are other ones, Imam al-Maqari also versified the 10 Mabadi. There are different versions of this. But this is a way of remembering them. So, inna mabadi kulli fannin ashara. The fen is an art. It's what we call an art. The art of logic. Fen al-mantiq. Inna mabadi kulli fannin ashara. Al-haddu wal-mawdu'u thumma thamara. So, he's saying that, well, I translate it down, so I'll just go through it. وَفَضْرُهُ وَنِسْبَةٌ وَالْوَاضِعُ وَالِسْمُ الْإِسْتِمْدَادُ وَحُكْمُ الشَّارِعُ مسائل والبعض بالبعض اكتفى ومن درى الجميع حاز الشرفا. So I versified this into English. Each science contains these 10 elements. The essence, or definition, because definition is getting to the essence of something. The essence, its subject and benefits. Its virtue, relations and source. Its name, whence it draws legal force. Add topics and all is contained. With mastery much honor is gained. So that's mustaf'ilun, 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 for those of you who have studied urud. So the first is the definition. A definition comes in logic, it comes from a tasawwur. You have to conceptualize something in order to define it. A tasawwur is to understand its form. And when we get into the formal the causes, there are 4 causes. So you have material, efficient, formal, and final. These are the 4 causes. We'll get into this in material logic. The formal cause is the surah in Arabic. It's called surah. And tasawwur is to get the image of the thing. And in fact, Aristotle called it the phantasm, the imago. It's to get the image of a thing in your mind. And this is grasping. You know, we talk about, I haven't grasped it, right? Grasp, right? That the mind grasps things. And so it's through the senses that we come to know the world. If anybody knows the story of Helen Keller, when she was a little girl, she became ill and she was blinded. She lost her sight, she lost her ability to hear, and she lost her ability to speak. Completely cut off from the world. She became like an animal in her own description. By the time she was about 7 years old, her father brought a woman who was also blind, brought her to teach her, Annie Sullivan. And she couldn't break through. She couldn't get through to her, because she wanted to teach her language, but she needed to teach her symbols. And the way that she was doing it was with her hand. She would write things, and then she would take a thing, and she would have her feel it, to grasp it. Because, I mean, imagine you can't see, you can't hear, you can't speak, but she can feel, she can smell, and she can taste. So she doesn't have all of her 5 senses. 2 very important ones, which are the inroads of knowledge. Inna sam'a wal basar wal fu'ada. It's the ears and the sight that Allah uses. These are the inroads of knowledge. This is how you come to know things, is through the eyes and the ears. She couldn't understand. And she did all these things to try to get her, but the breakthrough came with water. She was symbolizing in her hand the symbol for water, and she was pouring from the pump, she was pouring water in her hand. And if you read the description, it's a very powerful description of what happens to her, because she wrote her autobiography, and it's worth reading. But she's feeling the water, and her teacher is symbolizing in the hand. And then suddenly the light went on. She understood that the symbol over here, what's called an artificial sign in logic, the wada', right? It's a posited sign. This dalala wad'iyya was the same as the experience of that cool liquid flowing on her hand. She got it. And she understood that. What's interesting is she said suddenly her entire interior changed. She said a light went off in her consciousness. What's interesting is that night in Anne Sullivan's diary, she wrote, "I saw a light come into the face of Helen today." That's the light of consciousness. Meaning penetrated her intellect for the first time. She understood abstraction. And that is what we do. We abstract. This is the incredible gift that God has given human beings, is the ability to symbolize, to abstract, to understand abstraction, signs. We are by our nature sign makers and sign readers. And this is why the Quran calls it signs, ayat. Right? Inna fi dhalika la ayat liqawmin yatafakkarun. Right? This is what it's for people that reflect on what things mean. What is the meaning of the sign? And so the had, once you comprehend something, you have that grasping, you can then symbolize. So she had the water, she grasped it, okay, I'm getting that. Now she's got the symbol for it. right? So she can define now water. Water is that cool liquid that is tasteless, without smell, taste, right? Doesn't have any, or color. So we all know what water is. We have a simple apprehension of water, how we define it. It's the basis of biological life. That's one definition. It's made of a hydrogen, 2 hydrogen atoms, and 1 oxygen atom. That's another definition. And that's coming from the hal of the definer. Because a chemist will define it one way, a biologist will define it another way. But they're talking about the same thing based on the perspective that they're looking from. So logic may be defined as, quote, the art which directs the very act of reason, that which enables us to advance with order, ease, and correctness in the act of reason itself. And that's from a great Catholic logician, Jacques Maritain, brilliant philosopher who died in 1973. A little biographical note about him that's kind of interesting. When he was a very young man, he studied with Bergson. Bergson was a brilliant early 20th century philosopher, but of that new school of philosophy that was very radical and abandoning traditional philosophy. And he was one of his brilliant students, and he met a Russian, Jewish Russian lady, Raisa. They were at the Sorbonne together, and they fell in love, and anyway, they made a pact that if they didn't find the truth within a year, that they'd just commit suicide together. A very French thing to do. But they discovered St. Thomas Aquinas that year, so he ended up spending the rest of his life writing commentaries on St. Thomas. Anyway, that's his definition of logic, which is not his, but there are many, but that's his articulation of that. And then as a science, this is from a Muslim textbook written in probably the 1840s, 1850s by a great scholar from Fez. As a science, it regulates the investigation of concepts and proposition in ways that enable one to arrive at a previously unknown proposition. Another definition is the science that enables us to conclude from something that is known, something that was previously unknown. So it's going from what is known, these are the first 2 premises of the syllogism, to the conclusion, which is what was unknown. So that's a thought of Ibn al-Hajj al-Fasi. And then logic may be defined as the science that directs our mental operations, and our mental operations are 3. Understanding, judging, and reasoning. These are the 3 acts of the mind when it's in a rational state. I mean, there's obviously other states, but when we're communicating, this is what we're doing. So that they proceed with order, facility, and consistency toward the attainment of truth. The mental operations referred to in this definition are the 3 basic acts of the intellect, namely conception or simple apprehension, judgment, and reasoning. So that's from Kretsch, who's another traditional logician. The name is the ism. So you give sciences names. In most schools today, what was formerly known as logic is now called critical thinking. Critical thinking is one branch of material logic. It's part of material logic. You have formal logic and material logic, what they call the lesser or greater logic. The greater logic is material logic, lesser logic is formal logic. Formal logic studies the formal rules of reasoning, and material logic looks at the actual content of what you're reasoning about. So critical thinking is what logic has been reduced to in the West. In Arabic, logic is known as mantiq because it contains 3 meanings: the ability to speak, the ability to comprehend universals, and we'll get into that, and the power of comprehension itself. Arabs chose this word mantiq because logic strengthens the first, the ability to speak. It makes your speaking more orderly, more clear, more persuasive. Enables the second, in other words, the ability to comprehend universals, because you have to understand what a universal is, and we'll get into that. And then the second to be more accurate, and endows perfection on the third, right? So the power of understanding. Imam al-Ghazali called it the touchstone of knowledge. He wrote 5 books on logic, Imam al-Ghazali. He was a great logician. He said that he learned logic from the prophets because he studied the Quranic arguments, and we'll get into that, their arguments. But Ibn Taymiya wrote a book refuting the logicians, رد على المنطقيين, and he said, ادعى أبو حامد أنه تعلم المنطق من الأنبياء لكن الحق أنه تعلمه من ابن سينا. He said, you know, Ibn Taymiyyah claimed he learned logic from the prophets, but the reality is he learned it from Ibn Sina. So, he called it mihakun nadar, which means the touchstone of knowledge. And also the criterion of knowledge, he called it mi'yar al-ulum or mi'yar al-ilm, the standard of knowledge. It is also called the key to knowledge, miftah al-ulum. It's also called the balance, al-mizan, because the soundness of speech is measured by it. Another name given to it is the upright scale, based on the Quranic verse. Imam al-Ghazali actually thought that this verse was referring to using logic. وَزِينُوا بِالْقِسْطَاسِ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ. So he called it al-qistas al-mustaqim. It's the standard, the upright scales of knowledge. Aristotle referred to it as analytics, prior and posterior. It's also divided into major, material logic, and minor, formal logic, depending upon the subject matter. Formal logic covers the validity or invalidity of the syllogism's form and structure, while material logic covers the actual content of the syllogism. The late 19th century witnessed the emergence of symbolic or mathematical logic. For centuries, until the 16th century, Francis Bacon introduced the new organon, which the organon is the 6 books of Aristotle that he wrote on logic. In our tradition, Ibn Sina wrote a Shifa, which basically was an Arabization of the Hellenistic tradition because he wanted to free Muslims from any dependency on a foreign source. So he wrote the Shifa, and he definitely added some things to Aristotle's logic, and he has his own views about certain things, but it's essentially Aristotelian logic. And then from that, the metaphysical components were removed largely by the Usuli scholars, and Imam al-Ghazali introduces it in the Mustasfa, which is his most important work on Usul al-Fiqh. In the Mustasfa, he has a 40-page introduction to the Mustasfa, which is all logic. So it's basically a primer, and he felt that the Usuli scholar, a jurist, would have to have some knowledge of logic. Ibn Taymiyyah argued that the only form of logic that was useful was analogical reasoning, and he did not, he actually refutes deductive reasoning in his book and argues that inductive reasoning is really the only type of logic that has any validity. And this is pretty much the argument of Francis Bacon. Aristotle does not deal a lot with inductive reasoning. He did not consider it as important as deductive reasoning. And for a very simplistic understanding of the two, deductive reasoning argues from universals to particulars, and inductive goes from particulars to universals. So in inductive reasoning is scientific reasoning. It's looking at things out there and then deriving conclusions from looking at particulars, deriving universal conclusions. Deductive reasoning would be based on a type of epistemology that is no longer deemed important in the West, but is the foundation of Muslim, Jewish, and Christian epistemology, which is what they call epistemological realism. And this is, we believe in what's called mutabaqa, the correspondence theory of truth, that truth is what corresponds with reality. Reality is something that's intelligible, which is metaphysical realism. And, you know, just I'll say about this, Muslims today, many Muslims around the world are taught that philosophy is evil and Muslims should never study philosophy. The reality of it is that we are all heavily influenced by philosophy. Most of you who have gone to Western schools have imbibed a great deal of philosophy without really understanding it or knowing how it happened or why it happened. And you'd have to study the history of philosophy to really understand how these ideas emerged as the dominant ideas. But if you do not philosophize, somebody else philosophizes for you. It's as simple as that. And we are affected deeply by philosophical constructs constantly. Liberal capitalism, free market, these are all philosophical ideas. There are economics has philosophy, right? Utilitarianism. Most of the ethics that exist today in the West is, and increasingly in the Muslim world, is utilitarian ethics, which is a consequential, it looks at the ends of things. Muslims never considered that a basis for an ethical philosophy. Muslims always had virtue ethics at the heart of their tradition. Virtue ethics looks at the virtue of a thing. And this is why, for instance, abortion is a philosophical problem. And if you read arguments for or against abortion, they're philosophical arguments. If you read arguments for or against same-sex marriage, they're philosophical arguments. Because law has philosophy. The legal philosophy of the Muslims is called usul al-fiqh. It's legal philosophy. It is philosophy. It's using the intellect to think through problems. That's essentially what philosophy is. And so you're going to get it whether you like it or not. Whatever you call it, it doesn't really matter. It's basically thinking and learning how to think. And that's why this science was the foundation of it. And this idea that Imam al-Ghazali somehow killed this from the Muslim tradition is a great slander on him, because he was a great philosophical thinker. Ibn Taymiya was a philosopher. And if you read his books, you'll see he's making philosophical arguments. So it's important for educated Muslims to understand that. Not everybody has to study this, and not everybody should study it. But it's important that people in your society study it. And in an educated society, it's important that everybody has some degree of working knowledge with this. This should be primary education. Traditionally, in Muslim societies, this was taught at the high school level. It's not advanced. It wasn't considered advanced studies at all. If you read Ibn Ashir uses logic based on Barahin, which was a text taught to 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds. And he's using syllogisms. And logic should not be introduced in the pre-logical period. So a child really should not be introduced to logic until they reach about 12 or 13. That's important. So anyway, those are the names. Mathematical or symbolic logic emerges in 1913. A very important work, Principia Mathematica, was published by Lord Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, and Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was a brilliant mathematician, but basically really gave a devastating blow to traditional logic. Before that, for the last 2,350 years, traditional logic, what was taught. There were certain additions added with Bacon because of inductive reasoning. That was developed. And then John Stuart Mill also developed inductive reasoning. And then you have Boolean algebra, which is George Boole, self-taught mathematician from Ireland, who introduces another type of logic. And then you had Charles Peirce in America, a brilliant pragmatist philosopher who was also a brilliant logician. But before Russell, this is what was taught to people. It was taught in the United States. My grandmother, I have her textbook from high school, public high school in Wisconsin, and she studied logic and rhetoric. That was just part of curriculum. And people could think a lot better, I think, because of it. So they were better off for it. So I think we'll stop there. And any questions? Logic. Ibn Taymiya, rahimahullah, he was a brilliant scholar in his own right, and he was, in his mind, he was really trying to defend what he perceived to be this pure teaching that came to the Prophet ﷺ, and wanted to make sure that revelation, that wahi, was always central. I mean, his impulses, I think, were very honorable impulses, and he truly believed that metaphysics was very dangerous to the Islamic ethos. And he was particularly deeply troubled by two metaphysical thinkers, Ibn Arabi al-Hatimi, who was very influential. Ibn Arabi was taught in the Ottoman period extensively. He was called Shaykh al-Akbar. I mean, now he's anathematized by most Muslims, but since the 13th century, he was pretty much the end-all in philosophical Sufism. So he was very troubled by him. He actually mentions in his Fatawa, and I've read this, I haven't read this in a book, I read it from him. He mentioned that he benefited greatly from Ibn Arabi, Ibn Taymiya, until he read the Fusus. He said when he read the Fusus al-Hikam, he realized how dangerous the man's ideas were. And so he spent a lot of his life writing polemical arguments against metaphysics, and what he felt was that he said originally he thought logic was fine, but then he realized that logic is predicated on a metaphysical premise that he felt was very dangerous. And we're going to get into that when we deal with the universals. In some ways, Ibn Taymiyyah really is the first nominalist. I mean, the nominalism is attributed to William of Ockham, but I think it's arguable, and this would be a good PhD dissertation for somebody. You'd have to do a lot of work to do it, but I think it would be a very interesting PhD to look at the nominalistic tendencies of Ibn Taymiyyah. Anyway, any other questions?
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
It's very interesting that the logic wasn't taught traditionally to like youngsters, only once they begin to reason and tell the difference between certain things.
Yeah.
Is there a connection between that? I'd like to know if there's a connection between that and the categorization of knowledge, as in that hierarchical way that the Muslims used to do. Could it be relative to different age groups?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, grammar was what they taught. You know, the Muslim tradition, and it's not dissimilar to the Western tradition before the end of the 19th century. The Muslims believed that the great gift that young children had was memorization. That the mind is very agile, and the ability to absorb a lot of information is readily available to a child of about 7. And so they would focus on rote memorization without understanding. At about 12, the intellect really starts kicking in. This is what they call sinu tamyiz is 7, where they're moving out of the magical realm, because children before 7 they're in a magical world, which is why the Prophet ﷺ prohibited, you cannot strike a child before 7 years of age, and you shouldn't, because there's no taklif at all. At about 7, taklif starts kicking in. It's not there, but now they can really understand. And people say, no, they know before 7. My 5-year-olds know. They don't. They're not capable of lying. A 5-year-old, people say, no, he's lying. I know he is. They're not. In their world, there are different possibilities. Really, I mean, quite literally, there are different possibilities. So if they break something at 5 or 4, and you say, who broke that? I don't know. That is a totally viable answer for a 4-year-old. And it's not a lie. They're not making it up. It's just in their world, it's perfectly acceptable for them not to know who broke it, even though they know they broke it. But at 7, it's different. Now they know they broke it. And they know that's the only real possible answer. So that is the beginning of tamyiz. And then by 12, 13, as puberty begins to settle in, the logic kicks in. Now, what's interesting is in all pre-modern societies, mathematics was not taught to children other than basic rote memorization only. They did not teach any mathematics to children before 12 or 13. And it is well documented that a child can learn all of the mathematics that we teach between 6 and 12, they can learn between 12 and 13. All of it. And they actually learn it better, and they understand it, and they don't get the math phobias that a lot of people are traumatized from mathematics because they were taught too early, and so it's too abstract. Mathematics is very abstract. It's a completely abstract subject. And the child's not in the abstract world yet. They're still in the world of just sensory experience. They haven't entered into abstraction. So that's really why, that was the understanding, that you didn't want to traumatize. In fact, Steiner, I mean, I'm not a big fan of Steiner, so I'm not promoting him or anything, but Steiner argued that if you introduce mathematics or logic to prepubescent children, you'll actually disrupt the process of their, like the menarche, the onset of puberty will change. You'll affect these things. So you'll get earlier onset puberty because you're disrupting a natural evolution. And this is wisdom of ancient peoples. So, any other question? It's all clear. Would you say that in general the pragmatist school is consistent with the Muslim worldview? Not at all. I don't think so. I mean, that would be a whole long discussion about pragmatism and what pragmatism is. I mean, Muslims, we're all pragmatists to some degree, but a lot of the Islamic law is not based on pragmatic things. There are other considerations. Then the pragmatic one is not the only consideration that Muslims would use. Yeah.
Inshallah, this will be our last question.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. If animals have logic, as you've described, and we know that they have communication from the stories of the Quran, particularly with Nabi Sulaiman and the Hudhud bird, who had very advanced concepts of God and worship and things like that,
Right.
is the philosophical reasoning power that the basis of human search for God? And could that be the difference between animals and humans?
So what you're asking is is our ability to reason, is that what is the foundation of our search for the divine? Is that?
And the capacity that, because we seem to have animals seem to have most of the skills and the capacity that we have in
Right.
terms of communication and
Yeah.
logic and things
Yeah.
like that.
And even some productive skills, like beavers build dams and things like that. Yeah, no, I think more than reasoning, when we get in, because the first section of this, which I'm going to focus on more than any of the other sections, because what I'm hoping that you get out of this is a desire to pursue this study. This is not something that we can really do in 3 weeks. I'm going to cover the text, though, inshallah. But when you get in, the most important thing that I want you to get is the first section on understanding and the second section on propositions. On the reasoning, the syllogisms, I'm going to focus more on material fallacies than on the other, because the syllogism takes a lot of time and practice. You have to do exercises, learn how to reduce syllogisms, learn, there's 4 types of what they call the moods and the figures. When you get into that, there's 4 types, and they extend to 19, and I mean there's 64 possibilities, and only 16 of them really have validity. So it's learning how to work with syllogisms, because every argument can be reduced to a syllogism. Every argument. There's no argument that can. I mean, you have long arguments that sometimes take sorites. You have to use several steps to get to it. And that's why symbolic logic became a very useful tool for people that this is all they do is logic, because it enables you to get large, abstract arguments condensed down. For me, and when I get into the first section, I'm going to talk about the allama Adam al-asma, what that means. According to our tradition, what Fakhruddin al-Razi said about it, the single most important thing that we have, and the gift that we've been given, is not so much reasoning, but it is simple apprehension, it's comprehension, it's understanding. And that comes from our ability to abstract. And abstraction is a uniquely human thing. Animals, as far as we know, do not abstract. Angels do not abstract either, because they have immediate intuitive knowledge, so they don't go through an abstraction process. And this is why when the angels were told by Allah to tell them the name, they couldn't do it, because they can't go through the process of abstraction. They don't abstract in the way that we do. They have immediate intuitive knowledge of things, whereas the humans have the ability to abstract, and that ability is what enables you to abstract the divine from the material world. And that's why the material world is the greatest sign of God. People that are looking for proofs for the divine, the proof is all around them. It's right in front of them. And that's why that people that deny God are called blind in the Quran. It's a profound spiritual blindness to deny that there is a reality behind this that is infinite, that is conscious, that it has knowledge, it has will, and it has being. Whether it's a personal God that we find in the Abrahamic faith, or whether it's an impersonal God that is more in the Eastern traditions, because Buddhists pray, Hindus pray, they have a different concept. It's a different concept of reality, of the divine, but they still have an understanding that there is transcendent being, that there is reality beyond this, and that is the fitra nature of humans. The Abrahamic expression of that is through the personal God, and it's our belief that that is a real expression of God, and that's why we attempt to share it with others. But that is absolutely coming out of this ability. And one aspect of this is really about that. And that's why traditionally theology and logic were sister sciences. I mean, our theological tradition used logic. It was part of it and was never divorced from it after the 4th century, 5th century. So, subhanakallahumma bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Alhamdulillah. Jazakumullah khairan.